and we're going to start today's lecture with strategy. So what is strategy? Please don't overcomplicate this. Strategy is just the plan of action to achieve the company's long-term goals. So when we talk about strategy, we are merely talking about how the company plans to achieve their long-term goals. So there's a long-term focus over here. Now, what is the goal of a company? The goal of any entity is to create sustainable long-term value for their stakeholders and at the same time minimizing or avoiding any negative impacts on the natural environment and society. So in other words, we are not just focusing on profit, we are focusing on profit, people, and the planet. So even though the main reason why all companies exist is to generate a profit, to make money for their shareholders, that is not the only focus that we have. When we are trying to pursue that profit, we also need to make sure that we do not have any negative impacts on the natural environment, so in other words, the planet, or on society, or in other words, people. And this is referred to as the 3 Ps, where we talk about profit, people, and the planet. Now, guys, I want to unpack this and discuss this in a little bit more detail. So the first component that I want to look at is, what does sustainable mean? What is sustainability? And just below you can see, sustainability means that the activities of the company can be continued in the long term without exhausting natural resources. So let me give you an example over here. Let's say we're a company and we operate in the timber industry. So we have a tree plantation where we have a whole lot of trees that we've planted. We then cut down all of those trees and we sell the timber to companies that manufacture wooden furniture. Now, obviously, if we want to be sustainable in the long term, when we are cutting these trees down, we need to make sure that we are planting new trees as a replacement. And what we're doing is we are making sure that we don't exhaust these natural resources so that they are still available for future generations to enjoy. So that is sustainability. The activities can be continued in the long term without exhausting natural resources. Where we do use those natural resources, we must replace them so that they are still available for future generations to enjoy. So that deals with the discussion of sustainable. Second, we need to look at a discussion on long-term value. So the goal of a company is to create sustainable long-term value. So please note, we are not looking at maximizing short-term profits. Instead, we are looking at creating long-term value. So let me give you an example over here. Let's say we have a company and the company has decided that they are going to provide their employees with housing. Now, obviously, if we provide our employees with housing, that is going to have a negative impact on the short-term profits of the company because it's obviously going to cost the company money. So it will have a negative effect in the short term. However, if we do provide our employees with housing, that will improve employee morale. Our employees will then be more productive, and in the long term, it will create value for the company. So that is what the goal of a company should be. We shouldn't be looking at just maximizing short-term profits by cutting down costs, etc. Instead, we should be trying to create long-term value. And sometimes, in order to create long-term value, we have to sacrifice short-term profits. Okay, not entirely. Obviously, we don't just completely forget about profits. Companies still need to be profitable, but we don't just focus on short-term profits. Our focus must rather be long-term value. And then lastly, guys, we are not just looking at creating value for our shareholders, but we are looking at creating value for all stakeholders. And who are the stakeholders of a company? You can see just below. Stakeholders are entities or individuals that can affect or who are affected by the activities and the actions of the entity. They will therefore have an interest in the strategy of the company. Companies should identify who their key stakeholders are and what their interests and needs are. And key stakeholders include your shareholders, lenders, employees, suppliers, customers, the government, society, and the natural environment. So we are just discussing right now what the goal of a company is. So the goal of a company is to create sustainable, long-term value for all of their stakeholders. We are not just looking at creating short-term profits that only benefit our shareholders. It is, however, important to note that there is often a trade-off between profits and the interest of all stakeholders. So we are going to discuss that just below. You can see that there is quite often a trade-off between profits and the interests of stakeholders, society, and the natural environment. So first, what I'm talking about here is increasing shareholder value at the expense of destroying stakeholder value is likely to cause reputational damage, customer loss, or penalties, and is not sustainable. So here where I'm talking about just increasing shareholder value, we are talking about companies that just focus on maximizing short-term profits. And this is at the expense of destroying stakeholder value. So they don't consider the interest of all of the other stakeholders, their employees, their suppliers, their customers, the government, the environment, etc. So an example of this, guys, is the BP oil spill, which happened in the Gulf of Mexico in April 2010. So what BP did in order to try and save costs, so they were focusing on short-term profits, they tried to save costs. They didn't implement all of the environmental safety precautions that they should have implemented. And because of that, they obviously had this massive oil spill. And the cleanup and the reputational damage and the fines all ended up costing the company obviously a lot more than what it would have costed if they just had the correct safety precautions in place. So that's an example of a company that rather chose to focus on short-term profits at the expense of destroying stakeholder value. They had a negative impact on the environment, and that obviously caused reputational damage, customer loss, and penalties, and it's not sustainable in the long term. However, linked to that, guys, we can't also only focus on our other stakeholders and not focus on creating shareholder value. So that's the next point I'm discussing, is increasing stakeholder value at the expense of shareholder value. So in other words, we decide we are going to provide all of our employees with housing, but the cost of the housing is so astronomical that the company is going to suffer losses for the next 5 years. So even though we're doing the right thing for our employees from a social perspective, it might cause a going concern problem for the company in the future, which obviously is not going to work. So we can see increasing stakeholder value at the expense of shareholder value. So we only focus on people and the environment. We don't worry about profits. This is going to decrease company profits and the competitiveness of the company, and it is also not sustainable. So what we can see over here is the company must just make balanced decisions. They must make strategic choices that benefit both their shareholders and also other stakeholders if they want to achieve long-term sustainability. They can't only focus on short-term profits, but they also can't ignore short-term profits completely. They need to have a balanced view. Now, guys, what happened in the past is companies were more focused on short-term profits. They didn't necessarily consider all of their stakeholders. So in the past, when we reported on the performance of a company in the annual financial statements, our focus was mainly on financial performance because this serviced the needs of our shareholders. However, more recently, reporting on sustainability performance to all stakeholders has become more prominent. So now we're not just reporting on financial results just to our shareholders, but we now report on all sustainability information to all of our stakeholders. And we do this through an integrated report. And all South African companies that are listed on the JSE are required to issue an integrated report. And if you turn to the next page, you will see the key areas that should be included in an integrated report. So first, we have an overview of the company and its activities, so what the company does, or a description of its business model and how it currently creates value. So why does the company exist? What product or service do they sell? How do they generate money? How do they make money? We then have a description of their material risks and their opportunities, the company's strategic objectives. We have key performance indicators and key risk indicators so that we can track our performance. We have our annual report, which includes your normal historical performance, an overview of how employees and senior executives are remunerated, future performance objectives or a future outlook, and lastly, we also report on sustainability or environmental, social, and governance matters. So you can see the integrated report includes a lot more than just your annual financial statements. So guys, to wrap this up, it's important to understand that we are dealing with a very complex business environment. And that is because of things like globalization. So now South African companies are not only competing with other South African companies, but also international companies. And that's because of the internet. So globalization has led to increased competition, which means we are dealing with a more complex business environment. Because of fast-changing technology, we have a complex environment. Because of the global credit crisis, because of climate change, and also diminishing natural resources. All of these things have contributed to the complexity of the business environment. So it's very important to note that if a company wants to be successful in the long term, they can only create value if they have a clear strategy that takes into account the role and the needs of all stakeholders. So guys, all I'm saying here is if a company wants to be successful in the long term, they need to have a clear strategy. And when they develop that strategy, it must be based on a good understanding of the internal and the external business environment in which they operate. And that is what we are going to be looking at next. How do companies make sure that they understand their internal and their external environment? And after they understand the environment that they are operating in, they can then develop their strategy. And remember, their strategy is just their plan in order to achieve their long-term goals. And that strategy needs to take into account the needs of all stakeholders.